Thank you so much, Mateusz.
Great pleasure being here. So I want to talk about Barfield because he brings together two deep influences on your patron. He brings together Romanticism and Platonism and Neoplatonism, and he actually was engaged in a project with some people you might know as more famous, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were trying to bring about a revival of those two in an interconnected way. So he didn't really write novels the way Tolkien and Lewis did. He wrote essays. He was much more the philosopher of the group. And he's had quite a bit of influence around people who are trying to understand the fate of Romanticism in our current context. So I just want to give some credit to the work of Michael Vincent de Fusia, his book, Owen, Barfield, Philosophy, Poetry, Theology, 2016. And Barfield has had an influence on all of those fields in an integrated way. Now, de Fusia makes a strong case for the influence of Romanticism through the early post-Kantians and Coleridge on Barfield. And I think that's a very strong case. I won't remake that case. And I propose that we can use Barfield's project of a revival of Romanticism through a rethinking of the notion of participation. So this is a notion that is central to the Neoplatonic and Platonic tradition. I'll expand on this through the talk, but to give us an initial first sense of this, participation is knowing by the mind actually sharing important properties with what it knows. And it's often metaphors of conformity, of taking on the same shape or the structure of what is known. Are used to understand participation. And it was a central notion in the Platonic corpus. And I hope to explain to you why it turns out to be so central, especially the critique launched by the Romantics and launched by people who are trying to bring back a Platonic framework. So, Barfield's rethinking of the notion of participation and at the same time, he's using that rethinking of the notion of participation to renew an understanding of the role of the imagination. And of course, this is again an important theme in Romanticism, that the imagination is an important faculty whereby we gain knowledge of the world. And this puts it in opposition to empiricism that put a lot of emphasis on experience, and rationalism that put a lot of emphasis on reason. And of course, the scientific revolution is the integration of mathematical rationalism and experimental empiricism. And the Romantics were looking to something, an additional faculty to reason and experience that they could use in order to critique what they felt to be the inadequacies of the scientific revolution. So this is the history within which Barfield is working. But Barfield is going to do something very interesting in his argument. He's going to make a core argument. It's one of his most famous arguments. He's going to argue for a historical developmental model of participation. He's going to propose that what you can see is an evolution of consciousness. There's an early stage in which what he called original participation, in which the way we knew the world was this participatory way of knowing that gets broken in the scientific revolution, the framework given to us by Descartes, the Cartesian framework. For good reason, that framework is needed for science. And of course, a lot of this is due to science. Look around you. But then Barfield is proposing that what Romanticism was and how it needs to be recaptured and renewed is for Romanticism to see itself as a way of recapturing and giving us a new way of understanding participation that incorporates what we have learned through the scientific revolution. So you have these three stages: original but non-scientific, And then you lose participation. Consciousness loses that participatory sense of knowing. And then we return to it, participation, but in a way in which we have integrated with everything we've learned from the scientific revolution. So he's proposing a very ambitious view of what his work can do. Now, he argues, and it's appropriate we're here, Barfield argues, a philological study of word, meaning, and use reveals language as a fossil. This is his word, and he uses it a lot, and is obviously drawn from Darwin's theory of evolution. Reveals language as a fossil. If we look at language in the right way, we can see remnants of how people used to experience the world and how they meaningfully structured it for themselves. And by looking at language and its fossil, we can therefore reconstruct the evolution of consciousness, how people were aware of, how the world was meaningfully structured for them, etc. Now, I want to put this proposal of Barfield's into dialogue with current cognitive science, because that's what I am. I'm a cognitive scientist. And what is known as third way Platonic, Neoplatonic scholarship. So Barfield, and I'm going to put it into his work into conversation, dialogue with current cognitive science, and also with a new branch of Platonic scholarship. All of this is going to give us a conjoined and convergent way of deeply rethinking this notion of participation. Now, it may seem initially that what I'm doing is dismantling what Barfield is trying to accomplish. Because I will argue that the current cognitive science actually calls Barfield's central argument into question. That if we take a look at some of the best current cognitive science, Barfield's core argument, which I'll give you in a minute, right, doesn't actually hold up. However, what I want to then go on to argue is that this cognitive science actually provides strong support for a new appreciation, in both senses of the word, understanding and valuing, of participation, and an entwined new role for the imagination more properly understood. Another way of putting it is, I don't think Barfield's argument completely works, but it nevertheless points to central cognitive science and Platonic scholarship that converges strongly with Barfield's overall vision. So I want to try and continue to advance Barfield's project, but I think that is actually best served by disconnecting it from his central argument, which I think is flawed. Okay. So Barfield's key proposal, let's come back to it. What De Facetiâ argues is his key philosophical contribution is that our current way of framing the world is dualistic. Okay. We have a Cartesian, influenced by Descartes, cultural cognitive grammar. What do I mean by cultural cognitive grammar? It's culturally structured, but we internalize it into our very way of thinking. It forms the very categories and syntax of how we think about the world. So what is this Cartesian cultural grammar? How does it constrain us to think? It divides the world exhaustively into two kinds of epistemological claims: subjective claims and objective claims. And this seems almost natural to us now, that all of epistemology has to work in terms of these two domains. The subjective is responsible for appearance, and it is located in the mind. And the objective corresponds to reality. We even often say external reality, and it is found in matter. So we get this inner and outer world, immaterial, material worlds Now, Barfield recognizes, and he makes a very good case for it, that this Cartesian framework was necessary for the rapid growth of science. But, and this is where I deeply agree with him, he argues that this has left us in a meaning crisis. It's left the world in the place where, for many people, having a sense that their life is meaningful has become a profound challenge. I just left the UK. There was a national survey done in 2019. 80% of the population said their lives were meaningless. 89% of the most youngest generation said their lives were meaningless. Not kids, but young adults. That's astonishing. There's an overwhelming amount of research about meaning in life and the psychology of belonging that indicates if you truly believe, experience your life as meaningless, that you don't really have any place where you fundamentally belong, that you're in deep trouble. You're in psychological trouble, you're in physiological trouble, you're in social trouble, you're probably in financial trouble. It is very strongly predictive of things going very wrong for you. So I've done a lot of work, and I've gotten, as Mateusz said, I've done an entire video series explaining how prevalent this crisis of meaning, this meaning crisis is in the West. There's also pretty much general philosophical and cognitive scientific consensus that we should reject Cartesian dualism. It fundamentally doesn't work. I want to say why, and then give you some sense of why it contributes to the meaning crisis. Cartesian dualism is the proposal that the mind is subjective and in some way radically not like the material world, the objective world, the world that we can measure. The problem with that is how those two worlds then interact becomes extremely problematic. If they're so radically different from each other, how could my mind and body possibly even interact? How could something as subjective and immaterial as a belief or a desire actually cause a physical movement to go and get something? If mind and body are so radically different, if they share no properties, how could they possibly interact? And how could a physical event cause the mental experience of pain? And to make it worse, how could I possibly know what his mental states are? Because if there's no real way his mind and body can interact, how could I figure out what's going on in his mind by observing his body? I can't see his mind, I can only observe his body. So notice what's happening. I'm radically disconnected from myself, mind and body. I'm radically disconnected from other people. And of course, I'm radically disconnected from the world. How could the mind get knowledge from the world when the world is objective and material and the mind is subjective and immaterial? Now, you may say, well, this is all abstract. No, but this is woven into the very way we think and construct our systems of meaning. And what it does is it sews into the very fabric of how we interpret and understand ourselves, these deep disconnections. And the problem is that sense of connectedness is exactly what meaning in life is. Meaning in life is the sense of being connected to yourself, to other people, and to the world. It's a sense of being at home, where home has, when you're at home, you feel really connected. You feel connected to the people around you. You feel connected to the world. You belong there. The scientific worldview has created a worldview that explains, or purports at least to explain everything, except how we make the meaning that goes into our scientific explanations. We can explain everything with our scientific explanations, but we can't explain how we come up with our scientific explanations. We don't actually have a place within the scientific worldview. We're a hole, an emptiness that's not included. There's a lot more on this, and if you want to see it, all you have to do is watch 50 hours of my YouTube series. Okay? I just want to give you some flavor. Barfield is in complete agreement with that argument, and he adds a lot of eloquence to it. So, what Barfield does is to try and propose, if we look in language, we can look back to a time where those disconnections didn't exist. Those disconnections didn't exist. So, for us, because of the Cartesian divide, we map the literal meaning of words onto objective reality. Right? Some people get this mixed up. My younger students will say things like, "He literally blew my head off," and I'll look at them and say, "You have a head. You're using literally the wrong way." Right? So, we map literal language onto objective reality, and we map metaphorical language onto our subjective experience. If I say that Ethan is a wolf, you don't think, "Oh my gosh, we better get a gun and put him in a cage." You think, "Oh, John is interpreting or experiencing, or it's meaningful to John to see Ethan that way." Okay. So we have this very hard divide between the literal and the metaphorical. Literal, objective, metaphorical, subjective, and then what binds them together? Well, what binds them together is the function of representation. I have something in my head that's either like a picture or a proposition, and then we get 3 centuries of debate in philosophy about trying to make that work. But there's something in my head that somehow points to, is about the world. The deep problem with that is you can't possibly know that from within inside. In order to see that what's inside my head, corresponds to reality, I have to get outside my head and see if it corresponds with reality, which I can't do. And this is why we have the continual problems of skepticism and solipsism within the Cartesian framework. Okay. With literal language, we are oriented to the objective pole of representation. Representation is what's supposed to bind the literal objective to the metaphorical subjective. As I said, in metaphorical language, we're bound to our subjective act of how we appreciate, apprehend the objective world. This is a very problematic picture. It's deeply problematic psychologically for the way it fragments us. It's deeply problematic epistemologically because we can't actually get it to work to explain knowledge, but we can't just throw it away because the entire scientific revolution was based on separating subjectivity from objectivity. Now, what Barfield wants to emphasize, and I again share with him, is it's important to note this is not just how we talk. It's not just a façon de parler. This is how we conceive, perceive, and structure our perception and our attention of the world. So much so that if I was to say to you, describe the world, but don't describe it subjectively or objectively, you probably don't know what to say to me. You'd go, well, that's it. Those are the two options. Now, what Barfield argues is that if we look at ancient terms, we have fossils of when it was different. Now, this is going to be hard because as you probably guessed, I'm a native English speaker. I don't know Polish. I'm going to be having to rely, and Barfield's English, so my examples are going to be English, and I hope that'll work for you all, okay? So I don't want to be presumptuous, but I can't do it any other way is what I'm saying. Okay, so take a term spiritus, right? Latin, and it can mean wind or spirit. And we assign, right, this divided categorization. When it's used as wind, it's being used literally, objectively. And when we use it to talk about spirit, we're speaking metaphorically. Because there literally aren't spirits. Right? And so he does this with a whole bunch of words. Now notice what he wants to get you to do is to stop reading it as somebody who lives in the Cartesian framework. You look at it and you go, there's two different uses of this word. There's a literal use and a metaphorical use. And that's all very nice and tidy. What Barfield says, but if you go back and read the ancient text, that division isn't there. They don't have that division. Spiritus means both the wind and spirit. But even that's not quite the right way of putting it. I have to sort of bend language to try and convey. Right? It's both and neither. It's beyond the division of literal and metaphorical. It blurs the two together. There's no important difference between them. So we actually force the ancient text to be read a certain way. This is Barfield's argument. But if you look at it on its own terms, that's not what's going on. And these people weren't experiencing the fundamental divide of the subjective and the objective because of that. And he called that the state of original participation. People were not disconnected to the world, and they weren't suffering the meaning crisis because of it. And they didn't face our epistemological problems. They had epistemological problems, of course, Plato, the problem of the one and the many, a profound problem. But they don't have our problem, our epistemological problems. This is Barfield's core argument. So, people are not, the ancient people, according to Barfield, are not in a subjective objective framing in which the central binding relation is representation. That's our framework. Instead, they're living in a world in which the relation is participation. The world and the mind co-participate in the creation of meaning. They co-create it together. They are both being brought together by shared principles of organization. There's conformity. You have to hear this in an ancient way, that sharing not just the same shape, but sharing the same structure and functional principles, the mind and the world. So to take an example from Aristotle, who knows a chair better? Somebody who can merely describe, represent a chair, or somebody who could make a chair? Oh yeah, the person who makes a chair can actually cause it to be. And they've got a blueprint in their mind that is identical to the structure that makes a chair into a chair. And the person that can only represent it or describe it, they don't really know a chair. This is the conformity theory. So, in our picture, meaning is representation. The guiding image is a picture or a proposition in our head. In the ancient world, meaning is conformity. It is a coupling of the mind and the world together. The central guiding image, and I keep doing it for you, is contact, grip, touch. And we still have this left over. We say being in touch with reality. Get a grip on yourself. Okay. So as Diffusia argues, Barfield wants to foreground this binding polarity over the poles. He wants us to, instead of thinking of what's most real as the subjective and the objective, think, no, no, no. The polarity, the living relation of participation is the reality, and subjectivity and objectivity have been sort of pulled out of this. So you may think, well, John's like getting really invested in this argument. He's really trying to explain it well. Because I think the notion of participation is really important. I think there's something fundamentally right about division, but I think the core argument about language being fossils, language having fossils in it, is very questionable. So this goes to the work of cognitive scientists such as Lakoff and Johnson, and then also some work by, this is weird when you do this, Vervaeke and Kennedy in 1996 and Vervaeke and Kennedy in 2004. And here's what I'm going to argue. I think it's false to say we don't use terms the way Barfield says the ancients used the term spiritus. I don't think it's true that we have this rigid subjective objective divide. I think that's our official epistemological position, and it has all kinds of consequences. But I don't think that's how our cognition is still fundamentally working. So this is the idea that we also use language in a way that blurs the distinction between the literal and the metaphorical, and not just in a way of talking, but in a fundamental way of seeing and thinking. So to use a very famous one from Lakoff and Johnson, Metaphors We Live By from 1980, we will say things like, we attacked the castle. And that's, of course, a very literal sort of, but we also say things like, he attacked my argument. And we don't even notice that one is a very physical meaning and the other is a very abstract meaning. We don't even realize that in fact, we don't even sense that we're thinking or speaking metaphorically when you say, he attacked my argument. Most of us, in fact, don't realize that the first use, we attack the castle, is sort of more literal, and the second is more metaphorical, because of the fact that whenever we try to literally talk about abstract thought, we end up using these conceptual metaphors. They're not optional for us. And so they mix the literal and the metaphorical in a profound way. So right now, I'm trying to get you to understand me, yes? I want to talk about this understanding. I hope you see what I'm saying. I hope you get my point. I hope you can understand it. Can you grasp what I'm saying? In fact, even the word comprehension comes from comprendre, to grasp. Try to talk about understanding without using a conceptual metaphor. We use them all day long. And we're not feeling like we're jumping between the literal and the metaphorical. We think we're literally talking about our minds. One way of showing this is that people are not behaving as if this is just a way of speaking. There's a whole series of related conceptual metaphors. We talk about arguments having foundations, like a castle. That argument's built on weak foundation. Listen to the language. It's got a very poor structure. His argument was easily undermined. Undermining is literally how you siege a castle. He's defending his position well. Okay. In fact, Lakoff and Johnson argue that we fundamentally think of argument as war. Now, I have some criticisms of this, but I want you to see the point. This isn't, we're not pointing to fossils of some earlier historical period. We're not talking about that horizontal change through time. We're talking about something vertical, structural, the relationship between concrete and abstract aspects of our experience. Notice that we can get, by the way, notice that my use of the word vertical and structuring is an exact instance of what I'm talking about. Even the Cartesian, the inner world and the outer world, these are spatial, horizontal terms. It can get very profound. And I had a really startling insight about how this can even occur across different historical linguistic groups. So I make use of the fact that the word realization for us is a blurred term. Realization means to become aware of and to make real, to actualize, to complete. The plan was realized. And when I talk about relevance realization, I talk about something that is simultaneously something we're aware of and that's something that becomes real to us. That's how relevance works. But Nishitani, in his masterwork on religion and nothingness, does the exact same thing with the Japanese. He uses the word realization and he says, I wanted you to hear both of these at the same time. The mental state of awareness and the objective state of things becoming real, but they're not separate. That's what he's trying to get us to realize. What are you doing when you realize? Now, what's my critique of Lakoff and Johnson? My critique of Lakoff and Johnson is they're too empiricist. They think of this, they think of the sensory motor domain, the more literal domain, as just simply being mapped up into a blank slate mind. So their idea is we have an initial direct experience of moving around in the world, and we simply map that up into the mind, and that's how we think. And there's truth to this, but there's also falsity to it. In CogSci, we call this a purely bottom-up approach, that all of it, it's like David Hume, all of the information comes in from the senses. And the opposite is a top-down approach, that cognition is starting in theory or understanding and then structuring perception, more Kantian approach. We have bottom-up and top-down. By the way, notice what that language is. It's vertical, bottom-up, top-down. I think their purely bottom-up approach is far too simplistic. It doesn't cover the data well. Because it's not a simple identity move. We don't simply take the task in the sensory motor domain, like attacking the castle, and map it unchanged into the higher domain. So the way you do this, and this is an argument we do at length, if you want the argument at length, look 1996, you can do an argument with near synonyms. We can say, we attacked the castle, and we can say something very close to it like, right, we stormed the castle. Okay. And of course, he attacked my argument. But what would it mean to say he stormed my argument? What? That's weird. Attacked the castle, stormed the castle. Very near in meaning. Attacked my argument, stormed my argument. Those aren't close. Something's going on. Or do the reverse. He attacked my argument. Near synonym. He strongly criticized my argument. He tried to refute it. Let's map that back into the military domain. We attacked the castle. Yes. We strongly criticized the castle. That doesn't sound like we're doing anything at all. It sounds like we're standing back and not involved. It doesn't transfer. There's tremendous difference actually in meaning between attack, right, in the sensory motor domain, the military domain, and in the domain of argumentation. Here's another problem with the purely bottom-up approach of Lakoff and Johnson. Remember when I was talking about the different sensory motor bases for understanding? There was seeing and receiving and grasping and getting, things like that, yes? Pay attention to those, though. Those are very different things. How are they the same? How can we take seeing, grasping, standing, and receiving to be the same? They all somehow come to mean for us the same thing: comprehension, understanding. But they're so different in the concrete domain, and yet they're identical in the mental domain. If we were just mapping, how is that happening? And open that up even a little bit more. You have an unlimited number of sensory motor patterns. Out of all of them, you select seeing and grasping and receiving and standing as somehow capturing this thing that you're doing when you're understanding. But you don't, right? There's a whole bunch of other things that you can slap. I want you to use slapping as a way of understanding what we mean by understanding. I slap your point. You slap it. What? Doesn't make any sense. Think about how many things you can do, and the vast majority of them are not being selected. Some of them are being selected, and then a lot of their important concrete differences are being ignored, and an identity is being abstracted. There's a top-down process that is doing that selection and doing that abstraction. It is simultaneously top-down and bottom-up. It's not empiricist. It's not Kantian. It's both and neither. So, I want to show you that that's how your cognition fundamentally works. I'm going to show it to you with your attention. And this is an English example. I hope it all works. So, but this is from well-found experiments. So you read this? You read it? The cat. Right? In fact, my partner just sent me a whole text in which the letters are even scrambled in a more profound way, but you can read it. But this is simple enough for my point, because you read this as an H and you read this as an A. Now here, I'll do this, and it's almost like a Zen poet. In order to read the word, I must first read the letters. But in order to disambiguate the letters, I must first read the word. Therefore, reading is impossible. Get it? Because in order to read the word, I have to read the letters. But in order to read the letters, I have to read the word. How could you possibly do it? The answer is you're going up from the letters to the gestalt of the words. At the same time, you're going down from the gestalt of the words to the letter. It's simultaneously bottom up and top down. This is something as simple as this. You're doing it all the time. You're doing it all the time. So, what's a better proposal than the Lakoff and Johnson? How can it get us back to Barfield's notion of participation? So, I need to make use of a notion from the work of Michael Anderson, another cognitive scientist, and he makes use of something from biology, a process called exaptation. So, I'm doing something with my tongue right now. I'm speaking, yes? Do lots of other organisms have tongues, yes or no? How many of them speak? 0. tongues did not evolve for speech. They evolved for other things. And then evolution repurposed them for speech. Evolution didn't have to make a speaking thing from scratch. It took a very flexible muscle that was highly sensitive for detecting poison and sucrose, right? You had a highly sensitive, highly flexible muscle. It's the perfect thing for speech. So it didn't have to make speech a speech machine from nothing. It exapted the tongue. Does that make sense? Now here's the proposal. That is what your brain is continually doing. You know, see how this is a bottom up and top down? The tongue is already here, and then but there's a new function, speech, communication, and top down and bottom up, the tongue is being evolved into being a speaking thing. But you're doing that, your brain is doing that, not across species in biological evolution. It's doing it as you're learning about the world. So the idea is we learn the sensory motor stuff, but then we exact it up into how we move around in mental space. So we think of the abstract as above the concrete. We think of cats and dogs being close because they're mammals, whereas cats and insects are far from each other. We have to follow an argument. Follow it. I can't follow this argument. I don't see where it's going. I want you to just pause and think about that. Because we're used to thinking of imagination as something we do with sort of pictures in our mind. Like I ask you, picture a sailboat. You can picture it. And I ask you, is the sails up or down? You say, okay. What I want you to step back and reflect upon is your mind itself is imaginal. There isn't any literal space. You're not literally moving around. Abstract stuff is not literally above concrete. Cats are not literally closer to dogs. In fact, thinking that your mind is here is an imaginal act. Aristotle thought it was here. The Egyptians thought it was here. Well, my brain is here. You have no awareness of your brain. See, this is a different notion of imagination. Right? And this is where Corbin can help. The first notion, picturing your head, that's the imaginary. The imaginal is when we use imagination in order to be able to connect to reality. You use the imaginal space in your head to connect to the reality of your mind. This isn't imaginary. This is how you have to do it. It's not optional. It's not fictional. And here's the thing. Remember this? Bottom up, top down? What that actually shows is the brain is getting bottom-up information. It's detecting its environment, but most of the time, it's not detecting its environment, it's predicting it. Look, if I want to walk this size, my sensory motor system is not fast enough so that I can do that. I'll say that again. Yours is entirely. You want to run that like this? Your sensory motor loop with the world isn't fast enough to guide it. Do it. You have the cerebellum cortex loop. Most of what's happening is you are predicting how the floor is going to be, and you're acting as if the prediction is true. You are imagining, not imagining, imagining. What color's that wall? Yellow. Your visual perception can only pick out a small percentage of the wall at any one point. Like you see the whole wall, like the whole word. How do you do that? Most of that is prediction. You're imagining the wall. But it's true. You see? It's not a hallucination. You're not like, oh. You are imagining them. Now, is that literal or metaphorical? Well, the point is it doesn't work to call it one or the other because you're not literally detecting it. You're not literally seeing it, but it's not just metaphorical. It is not illusory. You are truly aware of the wall because of how you are imagining it in an imaginal sense. You are fundamentally connected, your mind and body, in this imaginal kind of participation. You are fundamentally connected to the world in this imaginal kind of participation. How did you, I think, therefore I am, Descartes. Ask a 3.5-year-old what's going on in their head, and they'll tell you blood. Because they can't introspect. Did you hear what I said? They can't introspect. They can't look inside their mind. I kept track of when my son first introspected. Must be horrible to have your father being a cognitive scientist. We're driving along, and he said, "Daddy, it's snowing outside, but only in my head." And I went, ah. And he was like really amazed by this. And then another time, he came up to me, and he did something really weird. He said, "I have a backwards camera in my head." And I went, "What?" I'm trying to think about this. And I'm going, oh, he means he can go into the mental space and go back in time and relive an earlier event in his mind. Notice how he has to first use images to try and make it even something he can get his mind around. By the way, just to finish the story, I asked him, does anybody else have one of those? And he said, no, only me. Because, right, the project wasn't done. This is how you get the ability to look at your mind. What little kids do is, so I'll be the little kid, Ethan's the adult. I will imagine how he is looking at me. Little kids can do, in fact, little kids can tell what's going on in another person's mind years before they can tell what's going on in their own. So they imagine, it's not imaginary, what's going on, and they imagine, so I imagine how Ethan is looking at me, and I imitate that. This is how Daddy is looking at me. This is what Daddy would say. Oh, Daddy would say this. In fact, you can go around the corner sometime in your house, you can hear your kids talking to themselves, and they're using your voice. It's creepy. But I do this, and I do this, and I do this until I can do it without him around, so that I can take, look at all this imaginal stuff. I can take a perspective on my perspective. And then I can say, I think, therefore I am. But I do that by being fundamentally imagined, connected to and through. We are deeply participatory in a deeply imaginal way. I think Barfield would have loved this in a profound way. I think his argument doesn't work. I think his argument, in fact, I think it doesn't work because I think he intends it to be, and that's why I treat it with respect, as an actual historical scientific proposal, because he's trying to provide an argument, right, that can be taken up within the scientific worldview. Therefore, it has to be evaluated by those standards, but by those standards, it doesn't succeed. But if we look at the cognitive science that is the basis of rejecting his core argument, we get a cognitive science that deeply embraces his vision. Thank you very much for your time and attention.